Hello and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope no matter what it is you're doing today, you're having a beautiful day. For the tutorial in Wirework today here on YouTube, I want to share with you two designs made with the same basic wirework form. One will feature some seed beads and one will feature some larger beads. I'm working with Jesse James materials today. You can choose whatever materials you like, but I will show you those a little bit later on. The first design that we're going to look at could be a wall hanging, could be jewellery. You could size it down to make some fantastic earrings, or you could wear that as a pendant. I mean, I quite like large jewellery, so it's entirely up to you. But as decor for the wall for Halloween, I think they're really, really cool. The second design that I will share with you is how to create your own seed beaded variation of the witch's hat design. So the frame itself changes very, very little between the two projects, so that's where we're going to start. So we're going to start with the beaded variation. I'm actually going to work in with the Halloween Fright Night collection from Jesse James, which is where these beads and charms have come from. You can use whatever beads and charms you like, but these ones I really enjoyed working up into the design. Now you'll see that although both of my witches' hats veer over to the left, the way in which the brim of the hat swishes obviously it could be the same direction as over to the left, or it could be the opposite direction. Just to give you an idea of variation, I think both look really cute. I'm just going to pop the seed beaded one out of the way for the moment. So the basic framework I'm going to be making with 1.25mm gauge raw copper round wire. That's equivalent to 16 gauge wire, so it's quite a sturdy wire. If I pop this up over to one side, we'll see how much I knock it with my tools as we get cracking on. Now I have a really large, long piece of wire here, and that's to allow me to demonstrate in quite a large size witch's hat. You can of course size that down. So this is your 16 gauge or 1.25mm gauge wire. So you can start really wherever you fancy, but I like to start over on the side. So I'm just going to pop underneath this, it's about 18 inches of wire. I'm just going to pop underneath and start causing the brim that curls up, just up and over the top in a quite gentle swoosh fashion. Once I'm happy with that shape, I just need to start forming the brim. So what I'm going to do is allow it to scooch up slightly to begin with, and then to slide down on the opposite direction like a very, very gentle S-bend. Now to enable this to be just a little bit easier for me, I'm going to start moving this around. So I'm going to grip hold of that wire and draw it back into a very much sharper S-bend shape. Now obviously you can play around with the finesse of the design and make it exactly how you want to. If you're going to make it as earrings, because they'll be on opposite sides of the head, I genuinely don't think it'll be too problematic if they're not identical. Or if you want to lean into that, make them completely different. Symmetry isn't for everyone. I tend to quite like symmetry. So I've come down to make the floppy undercurled section of that brim. I think that's probably a little bit too much, so I'm just going to open that back out slightly, grip hold of that section at the end of the witch's hat brim and just tighten that up slightly. So what I'm doing is opening and closing so that I can get this just a little bit tighter. I'm going to grip hold of the whole section and draw that back and around. And what I'm going to endeavour to do here is try and maintain the same distance between those two sections of wire until that comes back up onto the brim. So as I was saying, symmetry isn't for everyone. You can be symmetrical, you can be asymmetrical, you could even make something completely different for the other ear if you're going for earrings. My jewellery tends to be completely unique each time I make it, so it's indeed entirely up to you how you want to work with that. So what we need to do now is start coming up the side of that hat. So if I pop those pliers underneath, and it's just where the brim starts to curl underneath. I'm just going to try and show you that without getting my hands in the way. I'm going to take that out further than I think it would need to go to begin with, and then I can just tighten up that angle a little bit. Now, some witches' hats are quite pointy and rigid, and some seem to be a little bit floppy, so it's entirely your choice how you make that. So my wire's starting to naturally curl over to the right, so I think that's the direction that this hat is going to lean. If you want it to come back on itself, just curve in the opposite direction, like so. but I'm going to continue up in this direction. Now, to add some dimension to the shape, rather than having a flat witch's hat, I popped some creases in it. Witches, I'm led to believe, hang on to their big felt hats for quite a long time. So it might indeed become a little bit creased with time and use. So to create those creases, I draw in from the side where the section is going upwards. I draw that in ever so slightly, and then push the wire back around so that it comes back out. Now, these can be tiny little wrinkles, or they can be quite deep wrinkles. What we're trying to do is just pop a little form in there as we go. So if I push the wire back, I'm trying to continue from where we started on this section. We've popped in, made a little wrinkle, popped back out, and I want to continue along as if the hat just got a little bit of a wrinkle in it. So I'm going to start to continue on with that swoosh over to the right hand side, and then I'm going to create another wrinkle in the hat. So if I pop those pliers underneath, get a slightly sharper bend, and then draw that wire back and in the opposite direction. Now, you obviously don't have to contend with having a camera in the way, so that should be slightly less clunky when you are doing it. Now, you can have as many wrinkles in that hat as you like, and they can appear just on the straight bit and not on the curved bit. It's entirely up to you to make this your design as you go. So I'm just going to gently open and close ever so slightly there to make sure that I'm happy with the position. Now, you'll see on the hat I've got up in the top corner, let me just bring that onto a slightly lighter section, that there are multiple creases in the hat, all the way up the straightened section and in and on that curl. We're currently working on the outside because my hat's going over to the right. So let's pop this back over to the side. Let me just pop that down and get that straightened up so that it looks its best. And allow that to just sit back in the corner like so. I've added some drops and charms on the bottom of this one. You absolutely don't have to do that, but I think it looks quite charming. So I'm going to draw that top of the hat all the way around. Now, if you wanted to pop some wrinkles in at the top, it's exactly the same process, but you just have this imaginary line. So you come in, back out again, and then continue on to that line. So I'm just going to add one more wrinkle on this side. Push the wire, oops, I've gone the wrong way. Push the wire back in. Luckily, because we warm our wire before we start, we've got one chance to rectify that. So I like to leave my mistakes in the videos to show you what you can and can't get away with. You can just about get away with that if you've pre-warmed your wire. So the wrinkle comes inside the frame of the hat that we're creating. Push that wire all the way back out again, and we're going to continue along as if we've got the imaginary line where the hat was going to go before you popped that little wrinkle into it. So we got away with that. Phew, aren't we lucky? I'm just going to fine up the line just here to make sure that that sits on the line that we were travelling. So I'm just going to draw that in ever so slightly. We've come to the tip of the hat. This is quite a floppy hat. Obviously, it's leaning over to one side. So I'm going to create the very, very end of that hat. Now, I'd quite like to see that quite pointy. So what I'm going to do is gently support underneath that very firm shape that we've created, and I'm going to make that just slightly firmer still. I don't want to completely close it up because I'm going to use this frame to demonstrate both the charm drop variation and the seed beaded variation. Now, in order to get a seed bead in at the end, you need to have a bit of a gap available, hence the space just inside the tip of the hat. Now, again, you can have as many or as few wrinkles in the hat frame as you desire. What we do need to do is replicate the shape of that design coming back around. Now, because I've got 3 wrinkles in the hat on the outside, it doesn't mean to say I have to have 3 wrinkles on the opposite side. I quite like to have them staggered as well so that they don't look quite so manufactured. So I'm just going to put 2 wrinkles on this side of the hat, draw that line around a little bit further to begin with. I'm going to go inside the design with that wire bend, pop the pliers back underneath and draw them back out again. You can give that a bit of a squish to make sure that you're completely happy. So I'm going to spin the design around so that it's easier for me to show you the continuation. So I've made that much sharper than I needed to, but it means that I can get a really nice form on the edge of the wrinkle. So I'm going to put just one more wrinkle in the hat on this side. As I said before, you can have as many or as few as you like. The line comes inside the framework. We create that little very unclosed up racetrack hairpin. You can pinch them a little bit if you want to, but if you're going to work with the seed beads later on, it pays to have a nice open access point so you can wind those beads into position. So I'm just going to flatten this down a little bit, and I'm going to grip hold of the wire that's scooching off into the distance and then push that back down. Now, to finish up the actual framework of the design, what I'm going to do is make sure that I'm happy with the overall form of this hat. It's quite a jaunty hat. Now, at this stage, we have the opportunity to modify this design slightly. I think there's a little bit too much going on up here. So what I'm going to do is just straighten this out a little bit. So I'm very gently opening and closing those flat facing pliers like so, just to straighten that up slightly before I take the bend just a little bit further north. So you've got ultimate control over how the design looks and how it appeals to your sense of what a witch's hat might look like. So I'm going to just very, very gently warm the wire down at the bottom so that I can bring that to sit exactly where I want it to. Now, the segment of wire that's come where we started from, I like that to be on the outside of the design. If you feel that you don't have enough room, you can chase the wire all the way around. And I will show you exactly what I mean now. So I'm going to imagine where the brim of the hat would be. If the brim of the hat is this kind of distance from this section to the lower section, I'm going to try and replicate that on the other side, albeit this is quite an old hat. So I'm going to push that wire up and away to begin with. And I'm just going to allow that to sit down on a lighter section of the board so you can see exactly what's happening. What I'm going to do now is to create the point of the hat that's sticking up. You could have them both sticking up if you wanted to. You could have them both flopping down like this side. I'm showing you one of each so that you can make your choices as you go. So for this next section, I want the wire to be warm because I'm going to ask it to do a little bit of fluid modelling for me. So I'm going to pinch just where we made the bend from the side of the hat to the brim of the hat. Going to warm that gently, and then because I've warmed it and I draw the wire very carefully away, I can now fit that inside the other section of the brim that we created. Now, if this is too tight, you have the opportunity to open that up slightly. If you don't like this section or you think it's a little bit too difficult to work with, you can trim away as well. So it's entirely up to you where you start and finish the witch's hat. I liked it down on the brim because it's easier to pop a little bit of weaving in like we have here, just to keep everything securely together. So what I'm going to do now is hold on to where I imagine this section will sit inside. So if I pop those side by side, you can see what I mean. I think I'm going to just open that up a little bit more, give myself a tiny bit more flexibility. I can always change that later. And then I'm going to grip that wire underneath, push that back over the top, and draw that around the section of wire where we started. So that will sit inside like so. If you decide that you wanted that to be on the outside, you would continue to smooth the wire so it sits inside. It's entirely up to you. My choice, I think, today is going to be popping around the outside there. So I'm going to grip those very firmly. If you struggle with grip strength on your non-dominant hand, you can absolutely use pliers. I'll just grip that in my dominant hand for a second, like so. What you need to do is make sure that all of those wires are side by side, and when you're pressing down, you're only pressing down on wires that are side by side and not crossed over in any way. So if I hold that really firmly and draw the residual tail of wire all the way around to mirror the brim, the lower brim of the hat. Now you can take this part the way along, you can take it all the way along. It's entirely up to you how much patience you have with regards to wire wrapping. Now if I show you the seed beaded variation, I took it very, very short distance along, and that's because I wanted to add a little bit of zigzagging for the brim. In the beaded variation, I did a short section of wire weaving, but you can see how effective that would be if you continued all the way along. So if I show you what that would look like to continue all the way along, like so. We're just going to get that wire to do exactly what we want it to. Now, if that's getting a little bit tight in there, just warm that wire again. Lift it very gently like so, and just apply some body heat to make that do what you want. And it should become a little bit softer. So if I just lay that over the top now, what I'm going to do is trim away the excess of wire. Pop that in your scrap pot for later use, and you've got your basic framework of the witch's hat. Now, whether you decide to stick the wire on the outside, or whether you decide to stick that beginning section of wire on the inside, it doesn't really matter. It's very, very fluid in that way, but it just means that you have the control. If things don't go quite to plan, you can just switch that around a little bit. But this is the way I've created it for the demonstration purposes. The next part of the demonstration will show you how to add some beads in and how to seal this section at the bottom away. So I have now a short section of 0.4mm raw copper round wire. That's equivalent to 26 gauge. And what I'm going to do is just seal up this section at the bottom to tie it all together. So what I will do here is start by choosing which is the lower of my two free wires. And I'm going to wrap 3 times round the centre. I've got a section of wire that's around about 15 to 16 inches in length, and I'm finding the centre of that wire to wrap 3 times around the lower of my 2 brim wires. So that's 1, that's 2, and that's 3. Now the reason I start in the middle is because you've got less wire to work with on either side. And the reason I start by wrapping 3 times around one of those sections is so that there's a definitive gap between those 2 lines for the brim. So I'm going to start over here on the right. I'm right dominant by pinching with my non-dominant hand, and I'm going to create a wrap of my choice. So on this piece I have gone for 3 wraps on the lower line and then 1 wrap around both. You could replicate that if you liked. Another way is to do a basket weave. Now this basket weave is 3 on the lower and 1 on the seed beaded section. So we'll come to that a little bit later, but you have a world of choice with wire weaving. I'm going to go for 3 and 1 as we have done on the other beaded witch's hat. So that means drawing the tail of the wire, it's come underneath the lower line of wire at the brim. I'm then going to push the tail inside the witch's hat design and draw that all the way around both of those lines. Now it's just a case of continuing along until you've finished all the way along the brim of the hat. So that's 1 around the lower, just posting the end in between the lower and upper brim lines. That's 2, and that is 3. So every time I finished 3 wraps around that lower line, I'm going to scooch those up together with my nails. If you like your nails and you don't want to do that, you can use a pair of pliers just to very, very gently push that into place. So we've got 3, then 1 around both, and then 3 around the lower, so that means it's 1 around both. I'm pushing the leading edge through the hole that forms the centre of the hat design. So we've gone 3, 1, 3, 1, and it's just a case of continuing until you've gone all the way to the end of your brim. Now I have provided enough wire to make sure that we get both directions from the centre. If you're working on a similar dimension, I have fairly normal size hands for a female, and that is the size of hat that we've been able to create with the length of wire that we started with. So that's 1, 2 and 3. Scooch those wires up to keep a nice neat look going on. Push the leading edge through, and then you would continue all the way along the bottom of the brim size. If your wire starts to move around, you can very, very gently grab a hold of just the wire that you want to change, and you can just squeeze that very, very carefully until that fits exactly how you want it to. If it starts to move a little bit too far, you can always trim away a tiny, tiny section off the end if you think that you've left too much. Always look twice and trim once to make sure that you trim the correct piece of wire. Only cut away the bit that you don't want. Don't cut away the edge of the hat there. Now another way that you can create this same weave is to push the leading edge through. the gap between those two brim wires. This will actually weaken the wire a little bit more than pushing the end through. It's just a case of finding your rhythm, seeing what suits you best, and then going all the way along until you've either run out of wire or things feel nice and secure. Now, the reasons for differences between this design and the design I created earlier, this is something of a learning improvement. This shaping in these two wires that form the brim of the witch's hat means that once you've woven it together, there's very little manoeuvrability. It's quite solid. Whereas on this design, I only brought the wire part the way along. It's about a third of the way along the brim. Now, the weaving keeps that nice and secure, but to stop the end of the wire from coming away, I put a little loop on the end. Now, that isn't a bad thing because it means that my little droppers with the charms on the bottom stay in position better. This section at the top is like playing one of those games at the fairground when you don't make the thing buzz. You'll know what I mean if you've ever seen one. So that's just a little wrapped loop that we've added at the top to make it a hanging loop. So if I pop this out of the way again for a second. Now, I've no intention of continuing all the way along whilst you're watching. That would be very, very boring for you. With a weave like this, at this point where you've only got 3 wraps going around both of them, it's still slightly fluid. You can move this up and down. So you can take a judgment. I've got slightly more wire available on the left-hand side, which means that I'll put that section slightly to the right. And that should mean that we have enough weaving wire to go all the way along, and that will become a nice and solid section for you. The next thing that I'm going to do is show you how to make one of these droppers on the bottom of the hat, and also how to make a little, almost like a rosary link wrapped loop up at the top so that you can create a hanging drop for this design. So I'm going to be using the Halloween 2021 collection Fright Night bead box just to add a couple of pieces in. I will stick to my 1.25mm gauge wire for this, so it's a nice sturdy piece that can be used in decor or in jewellery. What I'm going to do is pop this half made section out of the way for now and just show you how to make one of those droppers. Now I'm going to grip hold of my section of wire. This is only about 5 inches of wire. You could be extracting that from the scrap pot if you have any available. You probably need slightly less than this, but that's what I've managed to cut away. Now you're going to need to ensure that both ends are trimmed with the correct side of those flush cutters, so that there's no chance of scraping yourself as you go. You only lose a very tiny amount of wire when you do this. What I've created for the droppers in the example section here is wrapped loops at both ends. Now there's very little tension on this dropping charm from the base, so if you wanted to do open and closable loops for a drop charm section, you absolutely can. If it's being worn as a pendant, it won't really matter. If you were going to add a charm with this kind of linkage to a bracelet, I would recommend always doing a wrapped loop, and the reason is that bracelet charms are much more likely to catch on things, so you want to have that residual strength of the wrapped loop to make sure that that doesn't come undone. For a dropper, what I'm going to do now is show you one end as an open and closable loop and one end as a wrapped loop, just to show you the difference between them. Both of them will work in this design. So if I scooch that over to one side, I have a random selection of beads to work with. Let's just grab some of those. Here we are. And we've got a charm to add on the bottom as well. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to create a wrapped loop down, which will go onto the top. And I'll add it to this section because we've already completed it. I don't really want to try adding it to the one that's in progress because I've not finished the weaving. So I'll show you how to create that wrapped loop like so. So what we're going to do is grab the round pliers, which weren't where I expected them to be, draw that around to create a nice sized open. At the moment it's an open circular form. What you'll need to do is make sure that this is large enough to fit over whatever size weaving section you've created down at the base of your witch's hat. So this needs to be quite large to go on if you've got that double line at the brim. So I'm going to give that a bit of a squeeze to begin with, just to strengthen up that segment. And I'm going to offer it up to my completed design. So I've made this over large so that you can see how large it would need to be if you were trying to encircle both of those segments of wire together. So you do just need to allow the rest of your design to flop out of the way. I'm going to grip hold of the circular form that we created with those round nose pliers, and I'm going to draw that tail all the way around. I would say a couple of times is plenty strong enough when you're working with a wire as heavy as the wire we're working with today, which is again a 16 gauge or 1.25 millimeter. So I'm going to trim the end away towards the back of the design and just allow those coils to be neatened up slightly. What I want to do is to make sure that that is neat enough on the back for my sense of happiness, and you can do this by just drawing that coil up towards the round section gently. And then from the front that still looks pretty neat, so just tighten that up if you need to. You can have as many or as few beads as you want on there. I'm going to put one of those resin glowy beads on and one spacer. Another of those beads. Now down at the bottom you could reflect exactly what we did at the top with a wrapped loop. If you were going to do that, you'd need to allow a gap just here, I would say, to reflect the same number of coils that you've done on that core wire. If you wanted to do an open and closable loop so that we can add in charms easily and change them a little bit later, we just put that in the center of the design so you can see how it's going to hang. What you can do is add an open and closable loop. So for this, be mindful of your beads. So grip hold of that wire just a smidge away from the bottom of the last bead. Draw that forwards. So this is coming forwards on the front of the design, and we're going to make a round shape. Now you can make it the same size and dimension as the loop that we made at the top if you like. It does look quite nice if you take the effort to reflect that shape and size. Always be mindful of your beads. We don't want to score them or put any pressure on them. So we're going to have a look at this section of circular form we've created. I'm going to pop in with those flush cutters and trim that at the point where it crosses over itself. So I'm going to squish that down to begin with, and what we have here is an open and closable loop. I quite like to see them centralised, so I would just draw that around a little bit and by hand give that a really nice shaping. The next thing that I would do is give that a really hearty squish to get that nice and strong. Once I've got that strong, I'm going to open this in the exact same way I would open a jump ring. Rather than opening like so, which will weaken the shape and you'll end up snapping it, you can open this sideways. So if we open it like so, you can see we've created a gap into which we can put the charm, which hangs from the bottom of our segment. So if I pop the kitty cat charm into position and just pull that all the way around, the only difficult thing about this, and it's not difficult, is making sure that you don't hold that loop form by anything other than a single strand of wire. So I'm going to close that back up. It's exactly the same movement, like so, put that back together. So if I drop this back into position, you can see that we have a wrapped loop at the top, an open and closable loop at the bottom, and we've added that to our witch's hat design, which has gotten a little bit knotted because I've been messing around with it so very much. So this is the one that belongs up at the top, which is a double wrapped loop made in exactly the same way as we just worked. Bring that all the way back down, and then you can just sit these three side by side. So you can see how easy it is to make an unfilled frame. You'd add your charm or bead up at the top, double wrapped loop, just to create an extender with a nice large aperture, so that could be hung on any kind of hessian or something like that. Looks pretty cool at Halloween. And that is the design completed. So for the second basic design for the witch's hat, what I'd like to share with you is a seed beaded striped witch's hat design. Now you can use any seed beads in any colours you fancy, but I have chosen to use some Jessie James in Design Elements Vintage Vibes, which is this one, and I'll show you those now. So to add some seed beads to our witch's hat design, what we're going to do is a little bit of back and forth. It's almost like channel setting, but obviously it's much wider as it comes down. So if I show you the back of the design, For every beaded pass across the face of the witch's hat, there's a pass of wire which has nothing going across the back. I actually think that that looks really charming, so that the piece is reversible. You can go with whatever side you fancy, but this is the side that I tend to design to be seen forwards. What I'd like to do is show you where we got to with the basic project. Now, if you're going to add the beads, you'd follow the first half of the design tutorial. For the second half, I'm going to use a couple of sections of 0.4 or 26 gauge wire. So I'm just going to free off around about 12 inches at a time. Now, the reason that I'm not worried about it's probably about 4 foot to fill this section, so around about 48 inches to completely fill that with wire. If you had 48 inches of 0.4 or 26 gauge, this is round raw copper, what could happen is it gets slightly kinky, and when it gets a bit kinked it can become weakened, and we don't want your designs to be short-term designs. You want to be able to get them out year after year and use them again and again. So I'm going to work in a couple of short sections of wire, and we're going to start at the top of the hat. Now, I had 3 different colours to work with. These are the Jessie James Design Elements Vintage Vibes beads. They're all a very similar size. I know absolutely zip about seed beads. In fact, it's something that I tend not to work with because it's painful watching me try and get them stranded up. What I can do is show you a couple of key techniques right up at the top, and then you can continue in exactly the same vein all the way down to the bottom. Now, we don't need to have all of that wire on in one go. We can work in smaller sections. It's easy to add in more wire. What I'm going to do is lay about 3/4 of an inch of the finer gauge wire, the 26 or 0.4 gauge, over the top of the main frame up near the tip of that hat. What I will do then is use my pliers to help me wrap around at least 3 times up there at the top of the hat, or the tip of the hat, whichever you prefer. You can even, if you like, fill the entire tip with wrapping around. It's entirely up to you. You can make this completely unique to you. What I would say is if you start at the very, very pointed end, you may struggle to get a bead into position unless you leave it really rounded. And I don't think that that's quite as attractive, but you do you. So what we've done is we've cast on, as it were. If you're a knitter, you'll know what that is. I'm not a knitter. I can literally do the knit bit, that's all. So I'm just going to flip this around so it's upside down. You may hear some wire scraping. And what I want to do is decide, I like the order of beads thus. You can have as many different colours. You can do it all the same colour. I like it to be striped. I think it looks cute. So you can absolutely go your own way with that. What I'm going to do is grab my first bead and see how an individual seed bead looks in the space that we have available. And this is why I don't teach seed beading very often. I struggle to put them on the wire. I've tried all kinds of different ways. What you can't do is pre-strand those little beads using a bead threader and get everything planned up, because you don't really know how many are going to go in, where the wires are going to sit. For instance, we may not be able to get a bead at all in this small section here. So you have to kind of thread them as you go. So one of those small, almost bronzy coloured beads is going to fit in the end like so. So what I'm going to do is pinch that really firmly, take the tail of wire around up inside the frame of the hat. Now, because we're working in quite close quarters, I'm going to ask my technical department to zoom in on this section now. So the wire has wound on the upper side as we're looking at it right now. We've added a single bead, dropped that into the channel created by the 2 sides. And what we're now going to do is wrap 3 times around the lower side. So if I pinch that really firmly, that's once and twice. I can push the leading edge up inside the hat, draw that back around so we've got 3 visible wraps. I'm going to go for another one, I think, because my beads are very small, and as long as I keep doing the same number of wraps each time, that's going to be just fine. So I've drawn that finer gauge wire all the way underneath the design. I'm going to protect my seed bead and use my pliers to close those coils up so that it looks neat and tidy. What I'm going to do now is spin the design round, hopefully keeping it in the same place. like so. And I'm going to pass the wire underneath the entirety of that witch's hat frame, and then wrap 3 times across the opposite side. So when the wire is underneath, there are no beads. When it's on top, you're filling the channel with beads. So I'm making sure that that's nice and smooth underneath, and I'm going to wrap 1 time to complete the circuit, and then a further 3 times, so that we keep the same number of wraps going. So that's 1, 2, 3. And then we have the 4th one, which forms the cross path, crosses over the surface of the design. Now, what you can do when you're seed beading in a position like this is on the inside of a tapering or curling design, you can reduce the number of wraps on the inside track or increase the number of wraps on the outside track. It's very attractive, but you can often forget where you're going. So you can do that if you like. On this piece in question, there are sections which have only 2 wraps on the inside and continue with 3 wraps on the outside, and then it continues to be 3 and 3 all the way down. But you can go your own way with that. So if you're going to alternate colours, we're going to need the next colour now, and I might start just by putting 2 on this hat and see if that fills the gap adequately. So they're going to go on to the end and zip line all the way down, like so, and we're going to see if those fit in the channel. They basically do. What we don't want them to do is to raise too much over the top, as what will happen when you pull the wire around the frame, you may shatter your beads if they're sat over the top. So again, we've got 1 wrap to complete the circuit, and then we're going to have 3 further wraps. So that's 1 and 2. And then a 3rd wrap. Push that all the way around and draw it across the back. Again, the number of wraps in a design like this on either side, it really isn't that important, but if you want to have an element of symmetry and neatness, it's worth bearing in mind counting those. Now, when you come to an inlet like so, you have the option to either draw the wire to that inlet and continue on further down the inside as you return, but I don't think we'll get a bead in there. So what I'm going to do is pull the wire up to the widest section, scooch those beads up just a tiny amount. We're going to do 1 wrap to complete that circuit, and then we're going to do our 3 wraps to create the pattern. So that's 1 and 2. And then we're coming up to that 3rd wrap now. So I'm going to push that down into position like so. And then we're going to add in the 3rd colourway. As I say, you can have as many or as few colours of the seed beads as you like. You can even size it up and use slightly larger beads, but you'll struggle to fit those in the very top part of the hat. So we're going to try with the 2 beads to begin with and see what that looks like. That actually fits really well. So that's what we're going to run with. So I'm going to pinch that into position, push the wire around the outer edge, and then we're going to make sure that we spin 3 further times around the framework. So that's once, and then we're going to pull that around for a 2nd time, and then we're going to pull that around for a 3rd time so that we can return across the back of the design, push that up neatly. Now you can, if you want to, when you get to tricky junctures like so, you could just fill this with a section of wire. You could even make a section of wire your 4th coloration band. In fact, that's what we're going to do, and then I would continue all the way down. Every time we get to the 4th colour, we're just going to use wire. So that's 1 and 2 and 3. Make sure that that's nice and neat and tidy. You can use pliers for this if you prefer. Push that into position and then pull that back over the front. So where we've got to, we could theoretically pop a single bead in, or we can just create that passing over this narrow section with just wire. I think that will actually look quite nice. So we're going to do 1 of those, and then we're just going to go for 1 more section of wrapping with the 1st colour that we use. So tidy that down. We've got 4 visual wraps completed. When you come to a section where you're coming further out than the preceding wrap, it's very easy for that wire to slip on down the side, and then you start getting curvature in the wraps that form over the top, which we actually don't want. So what I'm going to do is pinch the framework really firmly and use my nail as a guide to do those 4 wraps where we're going to next add on our 1st colour of seed beads. So that's 3 plus the wrap that we're going to load. So if you look there, you can see this is coming across the back, but we've hooked on to the side, which is wider. As I said, if you hook into the narrow part, it can look a bit funny. So we're going to add on the bronzy coloured beads that we started with. If I pop that down onto the slightly lighter section, and we're going to add on however many I think will fit. So let's have a go. Just need to hold on to the end of the wire now, and again, this is, I stress, why I don't tend to work with seed beads very often. So let's just see how many we can get on. I have tried all kinds of techniques, by the way, for those of you who wish to give handy hints. It doesn't work for me. I just ping them like tiddlywinks across the room. So we've popped those on. Let's have a look and see how that fits. I think that's going to fit really nicely with the 5 beads that I've added on. So we would simply continue on our way. So that's 1 wrap to complete the circuit. Push that up nice and tight. And then we would go for our 3 wraps just to create that pattern as we go. As I mentioned earlier, you don't have to have the same number every time. I just like it. I think it looks really nice. So again, across the back, we have a naked pass of wire. And we're going to go for 1 wrap to create the circuit, 2, 3 wraps, and then the 4th one will carry the beads. Now, if I just pop this down, we'll zoom back out. And you can see how those two would build up to be very, very similar indeed. Now, to add the loop up at the top, it is very simply a wrapped loop with an open loop at the bottom. So wrapped loop at the top, open loop at the bottom. You can go for, if you prefer, what is essentially a rosary link, which is wrapped at both ends, which would be slightly stronger. But because this is seed beads and it's really quite light, I elected to use an openable loop on this one. So when you get down to the bottom of your design, what I've done is I've tried to improve upon my earlier sections by drawing these 2 pieces together. So what will happen is you will have your last swoosh of beaded wire just above this double line filling up the hat, and you'll just need to hook on and hook off. When it comes to adding extra wire, if you run out all the way along, what I would say is finish up on one of these lines where you have added beads. So I'm just going to undo this one, and I'm going to say, well, let's imagine that I'm about to run out of wire. I'm thinking ahead. There's not enough wire to add on another row of beads and safely tuck that away. So if I flip the design over now, what I'm going to do is find my cutters, trim away that excess, pop it in the scrap pot, make sure that it's neat and tidy. And then I'm going to find another section, and I was working in approximately 12-inch lengths. I'm just going to grab quite a short length now because I don't want to waste too much wire. We've turned this back to the front, and all that will happen here is we're going to miss one of those naked passes of wire on the back. It's a really secure way of continuing the pattern. So if I spin that around so that it is almost the right way up, we've tied off on the lower side, so we're going to tie on the opposite side. So again, exactly as we did at the beginning, let's just bring that wire down out of the way. It's about 3/4 of an inch over the top. And you can just wind that around as many times as you see fit. So I'm going to go for 4 times so that it matches in with the pattern. 4 times in total, including the one that will carry the beads. So I'm just using my pliers to do this because it's slightly easier for you to see if I do. Tighten that up and trim away the excess. Sorry about the plier noise. That goes in the scrap pot. Make sure that's neat and tidy. Close that up and push it across into position. So your finer gauge wire will just continue along as if you didn't run out of wire at all. From the front, there is no visual problem with this at all. And from the back, you will simply have 1 fewer pass of that wire. So if I just put a couple of beads on here and then line them up as if we were going to completely load them. Again, I stress this is why I don't work with seed beads very often, because I can't get them on the wire easily. Some people seem to just slide them on there and it looks immaculate, but not me, I'm afraid. So if I just hold that in position, like so, it's very, very difficult to see where you added on new wire in a design such as this. So let me just pop the 2 finished pieces into position for now. And there we go. Let's get this one the right way up as well. So what I wouldn't do is actually add a third piece onto this because in where those two will slide down into the lowest point together. It doesn't actually look all that bad, but I would much prefer to just have the 2 charm drops off the bottom of the witch's hat on that one. This one I think I will probably continue with the piece that we were just demonstrating together, and I'll make a matching pair. They're actually not so heavy. Some people may not wish to wear them as earrings, but I probably would wear them as earrings, although the other one is markedly larger, so maybe they'll be pendants. I haven't decided. So I hope you've enjoyed 2 variations on a witch's hat for your wirework tutorial today. Have yourself a beautiful day, enjoy the rest of October, and I'll see you next week. Bye for now.